Okay, so get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into something that might seem, pretty typical kids and thumb sucking, right?
Mm.
But as always, we're going deeper, especially since you, our amazing listeners, are so interested in autism.
And that changes the whole picture, doesn't it? I mean, we often just think, oh, thumb sucking, that's just a phase for, typical kids. But for some children with autism, it's like they're trying to tell us, hold on, my sensory world needs a little adjusting here. And this article from Cheap ABA, it really gets into the nitty gritty of this.
Oh, totally does. Like instead of just saying it's about comfort, they use this phrase, self-regulation.
Hmm.
And that really got me thinking, it's almost like the feeling itself isn't the main goal, but is what that feeling allows them to do.
Exactly. Imagine if you were constantly bombarded with sensory information, almost like an overload. For some kids with autism, that's their everyday reality. So thumb sucking becomes their way to kind of like hit the mute button on the world, a way to filter out the noise and just regain a sense of control.
Wow, that makes so much sense when you put it like that. Honestly, I think I'd be sucking my thumb all day if it meant a little peace and quiet. But the article also mentioned that this whole self-regulation thing can be about seeking specific sensations too, right?
100%. It's not always about blocking things out, but sometimes it's about actively searching for that calming input, that sensory experience that brings them a sense of peace. For some, it might be the feeling of the thumb pressing against their palate, that physical pressure. For others, it could be the rhythmic motion of sucking, that repetition. It's like their own personalized sensory diet. And thumb sucking is providing this reliable source of input that their body craves.
See, that's something I never would have thought about. It's amazing how a behavior we usually associate with babies is actually this complex coping mechanism.
Exactly. And because it's so connected to their sensory experience, for some children on the spectrum, thumb sucking becomes their go-to for feeling safe and secure, especially when they're in, new or stressful situations. All
Like
right.
their own little portable security blanket. But, I mean, the article doesn't shy away from the potential downsides either, does it? It's not all just sensory zen and self-soothing.
Sadly, no. Like most things in life, there's a flip side. While thumb sucking can be incredibly helpful for some kids with autism, there's a point where, the potential drawbacks need to be kind of addressed. And one of the biggest ones the article highlights is the impact on their teeth, dental problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you really think about all that constant pressure on those tiny teeth and their palate, over time, it's bound to have some kind of effect on how their teeth grow in. And then there's the whole issue of potential speech problems, right?
Absolutely. The article points out that speech delays can be a real concern, especially if the tongue's movement is restricted by all that thumb sucking. It can make it really difficult to form certain sounds, particularly those that need very specific tongue placement.
And of course, then there's the social aspect, which we can't ignore that either, can we? Kids can be, well, kids can be tough on each other. And I can only imagine how a behavior like thumb sucking might, unfortunately, make a child more likely to be teased or bullied.
Yeah, it's true. And it's heartbreaking to think about because, as we've been discussing, this is often a child who's just trying to navigate a world that feels incredibly overwhelming to them. It's not about being different on purpose, it's about finding a way to cope.
It really makes you think about how quick we are to judge based on just what we see on the outside,
Right.
without really trying to understand the why behind certain behaviors.
Yeah.
But for all the parents and caregivers out there listening, maybe you're noticing your child sucks their thumb and you're thinking, okay, at what point does this go from being helpful to actually becoming a problem? What does the article suggest?
Well, they really emphasize that the key is to figure out the root cause, the why behind the behavior, because just taking the thumb away, that's like, putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper issue without actually addressing what's going on underneath.
Oh, it's not actually solving anything. If the behavior is serving a purpose, like meeting a sensory need,
Mm.
simply removing it doesn't make the need disappear, right? It
Yeah.
just takes away their way of coping.
Yeah.
So then what?
That's where you become a sensory detective. The article suggests that parents and caregivers, they really need to observe their child, like really pay attention. When is your child most likely to suck their thumb? What else is going on around them at that time? Are there any patterns in their environment or their routine that might be contributing to the behavior?
It's like putting on your detective hat and saying, all right, what's the sensory need that this behavior is trying to fulfill?
Exactly. And once you have a better understanding of that, then you can start to brainstorm like, okay, what are some other ways we can meet that need? And this is where things get really interesting because the article actually provides some really practical strategies.
Okay, yeah, give us the good stuff. What kind of alternatives are we talking about?
Well, one thing they talk about is creating a sensory toolbox, so to speak.
Hmm.
Basically, it's like having a collection of different objects, textures, activities, things that can provide a similar type of sensory input that the child might be getting from thumb sucking.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
So, for instance, they mentioned things like, chewable jewelry. There's also weighted blankets. Those are really popular. Or even something as simple as a piece of soft fabric that the child can rub between their fingers.
I've heard of those chewable necklaces and things for
Mhm.
those kids who are always like biting or chewing on things, right? So it's kind of like redirecting that oral sensory seeking to something that's, more acceptable.
Exactly. And they also highlight the importance of heavy work activities.
Heavy work.
Yeah, these are basically activities that get those larger muscle groups working. So think like pushing, pulling, lifting, or even just like wrapping the child tightly in a blanket like a little burrito.
Oh, the burrito technique. Yeah, I have a friend who swears by that for her little one. Apparently, he just finds it super calming. But why does that work? What's the science behind that?
It's all about something called proprioceptive input. Those heavy work activities, they really help regulate the body's awareness of where it is in space. Like, think about that feeling of being hugged really tightly, it can be very grounding, very calming, especially for someone who's sensitive to sensory input.
Ah, okay. So it's like giving their sensory system this big, warm hug. Definitely better than a thumb, I'd say.
Hmm.
But I imagine it's probably not always easy to just like magically find the right alternatives or even just to know where to start.
You're absolutely right. And the article acknowledges that this is a process. It takes time, it takes patience, and it often involves a lot of trial and error. And they also really emphasize how important it is to work closely with the child's therapist or occupational therapist if they have one.
Right, because every child is different. Every sensory system is unique. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, is there?
Exactly. It's about figuring out what works best for that individual child. And I think that's a really important takeaway for our listeners. It's not about forcing a behavior to stop. It's about understanding the reason behind it and then finding solutions that are both compassionate and creative.
Okay, so we've talked about the why behind thumb sucking in kids with autism. We've explored some potential alternatives, but was there anything else in the article that really stood out to you?
It really strikes me how this article kind of reframes our whole way of thinking about something that might seem like just a small, insignificant habit. It's not really about the thumb itself, right? It's about understanding what the behavior is trying to tell us, especially in kids with autism. Yeah, that's a really powerful way to put it. It's like we're trying to decipher the secret language,
Hmm.
recognizing that these actions, the things they do, are sometimes their way of communicating a need that they might not have the words for yet.
It's so true. It reminds me of this time I was at the park with my nephew. He has autism, and he was playing with this little toy car, and he just kept spinning it over and over and over. At first, I was like, oh, that's cute. But then I remembered something I had learned about repetitive behaviors and how, for some kids on the spectrum, they can be really visually stimulating. So I got down on the floor with him, and I started really looking at the toy, the way the light was reflecting off of it as it spun, all those tiny details on the wheels. And it hit me. He's not just spinning a car, he's totally immersed in this whole sensory experience that I was completely missing.
That is a perfect example of what this article is all about. It's about shifting our perspective, Instead of thinking, that's strange, or they need to stop doing that, it's about asking ourselves, what are they getting out of this?
Mm.
It's about approaching these behaviors with a sense of curiosity, with empathy, and recognizing them as like valuable clues into a child's sensory needs.
So true.
Mhm.
So for our listeners who've been on this journey with us, diving deep into this whole world of sensory seeking and self-regulation, what's one thing they can take away from this? Like something they can apply in their own lives, even if they haven't read the article.
I would say this. The next time you see a child with autism engaging in a repetitive behavior, any behavior, whether it's thumb sucking or hand flapping or spinning, anything, don't just brush it off.
Mm.
Take a moment to ask yourself, what sensory need might this behavior be fulfilling? Challenge yourself to see it as a form of communication, their way of telling you something important about how they experience the world. You might be really surprised by what you discover.
It's like we always say, right? Every behavior has a meaning. And once you understand that meaning, it can open up all these new ways to connect and support that child. And that's what I love about these deep dives. We get to uncover all these hidden depths beneath the surface of what we might think we already know. So until next time, keep those brains engaged, those perspectives shifting. And remember, there's always more to learn.